Hello, students. Let's stick with the Cold War and move through the 50s, 60s, and 70s and deal with particularly Vietnam and Cuba and how they are part of decolonization as well as the Cold War. All right, so remember the Cold War in particular from the American and Russian perspective is focused on Europe, post-World War II issues. We've talked about that before. We're not going to get into that today. But let's look to what happened in the post-colonial world in Indochina or Southeast Asia. So Vietnam is part of the French colony of Indochina, French Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. You can see these three countries are next to Thailand and also China up here to the north. The war aims of World War II, remember, are to end the colonies. That's in the Atlantic Charter. And Ho Chi Minh had wanted independence since World War I. He had been part of a delegation that had gone to the Paris Peace Conferences at the end of World War I. And he agreed to fight with the Allies against the Japanese forces in Indochina during World War II. So his Viet Minh is allied with the U.S. against the Japanese. Vietnam, here's a better map of it. You can see where at this point early in the war, the Japanese, their empires have taken over French Indochina. They're going to take over the Dutch East Indies shortly thereafter. Vietnam's a very beautiful place. This mountain chain kind of divides Vietnam from Cambodia and Laos. And the French have been there for hundreds of years as their colonial masters. All right, so during World War II, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. End of World War II. So 1945, September 2nd, Ho Chi Minh proclaims independence of Vietnam from France, while members of the United States Office of Strategic Service, the OSS, this is the precursor to the CIA, stood on the stage while Ho Chi Minh quotes from Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence, and it seems like this is all going to be part of the decolonization at the end of World War II. After World War II, however, France wanted to keep Indochina. Remember, Franklin Delano Roosevelt has died. We have a brand new president, Harry Truman. Truman's much more concerned about the Cold War in Europe, not sure what's going on over there in Asia, and he says he's willing to support France in its struggle to keep this colony, since the United States needed France to be in NATO and to be part of the Cold War struggle in Europe, and was just kind of letting Asia go its own way for the moment. Now, in 1946, the Viet Minh, who are the Allied, the military or paramilitary or military group that's working with Ho Chi Minh to fight the Japanese, now turn their struggle back to an independence movement and start fighting against the French and what is known as the French Indochina War. All right, so a little bit of background. Ho Chi Minh, he's a Vietnamese nationalist. He is a communist. And as I mentioned before, he was at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Not as anybody super important, but he was a part of a delegation. His power base is in the north. He's the leader of the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh is the communist-led nationals who wanted independence from France. They've been advocating for this again since the 19-teens. And then they're going to turn their attention to the United States, and the U.S. gets involved. The Viet Cong is what the South Vietnamese, once there's a newly created country called South Vietnam, starts calling the Viet Minh to try to emphasize their communist connections. So South Vietnamese who wanted Ho Chi Minh to rule over United Vietnam under a communist government. But it's really the remnants of the Viet Minh once North and South Vietnam are created, and then they get renamed Viet Cong by the South Vietnamese pro-American government as a way to make this all part of the Cold War. Now, the Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh would not necessarily see this as part of the Cold War, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So let's do the French Indochina War, 1946, 1954. U.S. will be mostly uninvolved in this. I'm just going to hit some of the highlights here. France fought to maintain colonial control of Indochina, but by 1953, France is losing, is asking the United States for help, is painting this more as instead of a pro-colonialism or empire building that the French are doing as part of this Cold War struggle that we're now in the midst of by 1953. You also have the Korean War going on at the exact same time up in the northern part of Asia, and France is fighting its colonial war down here in the south. The turning point of this whole French Indochina War is this Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Takes place in this valley. You can see that's what the picture here is this beautiful valley in the north, right on the border with Laos and northern Vietnam. And it was the main way that the French controlled this part of their colony. and it can only really be resupplied easily by air. So they have a big air base there, which is going to be the first thing the Viet Minh destroy. So therefore, the French are going to be isolated. Now, they're under attack. Things are looking bad. In February 1954, the French have all but lost this war, and they turn to the United States. And they asked President Eisenhower, actually, they asked the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, about the use of atomic weapons to help fight against the Viet Minh in Indochina, and the Secretary of State thinks this is a good idea. President Eisenhower, he will refuse to do this. He will see this as not a good idea. Of dropping more atomic bombs on Asian people does not look good, and using the atomic bomb to help France keep a colony is even more stupid. France will lose that battle of Dien Bien Phu and will then begin to negotiate an end to this war. So Dien Bien Phu falls, agreed to negotiate a peace settlement. And here's where it gets a little bit more complicated. So the war is all but over. The French are going to get out of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Their main power, or their main place of leaving, is going to be in the southern part of Vietnam here and come out through Saigon. So they're going to work out an agreement to kind of transition out of their colony. So this happens to happen at the same time there is a Geneva conference going on that's dealing with what are war crimes and what are definitions of weapons of war and weapons of mass destruction and those kind of things. And so they meet at this international conference on the side. So they create what are known as the Geneva Agreements between France and its Indochina colony. So I've just kind of numbered them out here about the key ones that are going to deal with France getting out of Vietnam, and they're getting out of Laos and Cambodia as well. So France will leave Vietnam within 2 years. They've been there hundreds of years. It takes a little while to get out. While France leaves, Vietnam will be divided at the 17th parallel, and people will be allowed to move north and south. And the French will be moving first all their materials out of the north down to Saigon so they can get them out and just kind of separate all the military and separate everything. And then after 300 days, other people can move around as well. They're going to create a demilitarized zone, a DMZ, between the northern half and the southern half. Now, again, we're dealing with dividing Vietnam north and south at the same moment that, again, Korea's already been divided north and south, and their war is just coming to their own ceasefire in 1954. And we still got a divided East and West Germany. So the idea here in the Geneva Conventions, our agreements, are that in 1956, once the French are completely out of Vietnam, a new government will be formed, elections will be held, and Vietnam will be its own independent country. And during this 2-year transition period, there'll be no new alliances formed between any of the Vietnamese organizations, north or south. And this will just be, we're getting out, and then you can start fresh. The United States does not sign on to this international agreement. They don't think it's a good idea. They don't like it. And John Foster Dulles, he's at this conference, and he is definitely going to start promoting Vietnam and Korea as being part of the Cold War in Asia, and then becomes a little bit more of a sticking point. All right. So there's two views of this Vietnam conflict now as we start going forward. So clearly, it was really the end of a colonial empire for the French, and that part should have ended. But the United States now, as a superpower in the 1950s, having dealt with Korea, having not been happy with the end of that, having this look like more land is being lost to communists down in Vietnam, are starting to express this concern of what they call the domino theory. That as countries fall to communism, then the countries next door will also fall to communism. And it's kind of how they somewhat viewed what Hitler did, as he kind of worked his way through Europe and conquered all the countries. It's not a great theory. It doesn't really make that much sense. But the idea is that somehow these communists or anti-colonial or these anti-American or Cold War ideas, whatever you want to call them, will infect the next country or cause revolutions, and then suddenly everything will fall to communism, and India will be communist, and then all of the Middle East will be communism. And it's just, that's the working theory of the Cold War anti-communists in the United States. And therefore, Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh, they're just dominoes. They're just minor players, pawns in this giant Cold War struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. That is not reality. But that is how the United States will make its policies, and also to a certain degree how the Soviet Union will be looking at the world as well. The other parts of the world who don't want to be part of the struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, well, some will be able to go their own third way, and India is a classic example of that, just trying to stay out of it, and there's other countries as well. But Harry Truman and then President Eisenhower are going to be dealing with this particular idea, and it fits in with the Cold War and the containment doctrine and the Truman Doctrine. All right, from the Vietnamese point of view, this 20th century struggle has been a revolution for independence. And this is the final kind of part of this civil war for control of Vietnam that's going to occur between northern Vietnam and southern Vietnam. So the Viet Minh have fought the Japanese in World War II for exchange for an end of French colonialism. After World War II, the United States and France are going to break this agreement that they had made during World War II to fight the Japanese, and therefore the Viet Minh begin their revolution for independence. The Viet Minh will defeat France, as we just mentioned, in 1954. And the Viet Minh, the Vietnamese, they don't see this as really part of this greater Cold War struggle because they've been struggling for independence since before the Cold War began. Now, this is the problem, that when you're teaching history and you're trying to explain what's really going on, you're trying to explain the thinking behind the nations that are in conflict, and the nations in conflict don't always view the conflict with the same definition of what's going on. And this is a classic example of that here with what is Vietnam, what is the Vietnam War really within this Cold War argument. All right, so let's get back to kind of the U.S. version of what's going on in Vietnam. In 1954, the United States is going to create a nation. That's what's called nation building. That's going to be called the Republic of Vietnam, more commonly known as South Vietnam. Never been a South Vietnam versus a North Vietnam. It had been colonized by the French, it had been colonized by the Chinese in their history. They've been an independent country at different times in their history. But now there is a North Vietnam run by Ho Chi Minh, and there's a South Vietnam that's going to be run by a very pro-American president or prime minister, and then President Ngo Dinh Diem. He's elected president in 1955 prior to the Geneva Agreement, since they knew that Ho Chi Minh was much more popular, and if they held the election in 1956 as a nationwide election, Ho Chi Minh would have won, and this whole thing would not have functioned as let's do some nation building in the South and create a democracy that's pro-American. So Diem, he wins 98.2% of the vote. Clear voter fraud. Nobody wins 98% of the vote. The whole thing is just an embarrassment. All right. Now, we've seen this. There's North Vietnam, there's the DMZ, South Vietnam. Cambodia and Laos are going to ignore for the moment. They're going to have their own conflicts after the Vietnam War is over. There are some much later, and this picture is from in the late 60s, people looking back at it while the Vietnam War is going on, because the U.S. will get into the war, but not until the 60s. In this beginning 50s period, it's going to be known as nation buildings. But this other picture with Stalin's head on this octopus does give you this idea of kind of this domino theory or this expanding communism. So are we going to see South Vietnam as a puppet, as part of this U.S. imperialism, or are we really afraid of communism, or is it just really kind of a sideshow to the greater struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union? Well, it's a little bit of all that. All right. So 1957, 1960. Still no U.S. Vietnam War yet. The Viet Minh who lived in the South rebelled against Diem, and by 1959 took control of much of the rural South. So we see the kind of civil war playing out like we'd seen going on in China in the 1940s and up in Korea prior to the U.S. involvement. North Vietnam, or known more formally as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, had built a dirt road through the mountains to supply the Southern Rebellion, known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Here you can see on this map that they're kind of going into these other parts of Indochina, bringing in supplies, and the more rural areas are turning towards the communists as a more legitimate pro-Vietnam way of controlling the country, whereas the strength of the U.S. and its allies in South Vietnam are going to be in the urban areas. Diem renames these rebels, these old Viet Minh, as Viet Cong, Vietnamese communists, to emphasize that he's fighting commies during the Cold War so he can get more money and more supplies from the United States. Diem also corrected on all political opposition using U.S.-trained Army of the Republic of Vietnam, sometimes shorthand as ARVN, ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam. That's the South Vietnamese Army. And clearly this Diem, he is not pro-democracy. He doesn't mind capitalism as long as it lines his pockets. He likes America so he can stay in charge, but this is a disaster from day one. All right, so let's take a break because we're up to 1960. We're going to get President Kennedy. And while this is going on in Vietnam, we have issues going on in Cuba. So in Cuba, which is much closer to the United States, and much more of a concern of the United States for most people in the United States, and U.S. citizens are a little bit more familiar with what's going on in Cuba since we have this special relations going all the way back to the Spanish-American War, which we talked about way back when. But again, now that we're in this anti-colonial period of the Cold War, Cuba doesn't want to be seen as an unofficial colony of the United States, and Fidel Castro here on the right will lead a rebellion against Batista, the president of Cuba, who again elected in a shady election, very pro-American, making deals with the mafia to build casinos and making Cuba into not only a great sugar and tobacco plantation haven, but a kind of a Las Vegas before Las Vegas. All right, on this map you can see U.S. interventions in Cuba at the end of the Spanish-American War, early 1900s, again in the 1920s, and then kind of known as a protectorate until the 1930s. The good neighbor policy in the 1930s is supposed to kind of pull away from U.S. dominating Cuba so much, but we still like to make sure that pro-American people are in power in Cuba. All right, so Batista, he's running for president in 1952, kind of backing up here a little bit, seizes power in an almost bloodless coup 3 months before the election was to take place. President Prior, the old president, did nothing to stop this coup and is forced to leave the island. So we got a new person as president, comes about in a coup. There was an election to be held. He will hold an election later on that's clearly corrupt. But due to the corruption in the past two administrations, the general public reaction to the coup was somewhat accepting at first, because maybe the new guy won't be as bad as the old guy. And it turns out all these dictators tend to do the same kind of civil rights violations. So Batista opened the way for large-scale gambling in Havana. He announced that his government would match dollar for dollar any hotel investment of over $1 million, which would include a casino license. So like I said, Havana becomes this Latin Las Vegas, playground of choice for many of the gamblers. And all opposition was swiftly and violently crushed by this new Batista government in the early 1950s. Now, getting to Cuba from Miami is very easy. Getting from New York to Miami and then to Cuba, it becomes kind of this East Coast where you stay in the same time zone and just fly north and south for the wealthy and those who, you think, well, you leave the country, you're in Cuba, you can kind of get away with quite a bit as an American citizen and then fly out of the country before your crimes are discovered. Okay, so Batista will suspended constitutional guarantees and established tighter censorship of the media. So he's not pro-democracy, he's just pro-American. His military police would patrol the streets and pick up anyone suspected of insurrections. And by the end of 1955, they had grown more prone to violent acts of brutality and torture with no fear of legal repercussions. So it's 1955. We've got the U.S. getting involved in Vietnam. We've got the end of the Korean War and trying to, settle that stalemate over there. We've got, actually, in 1956, you're going to see an uprising in Hungary and in Europe, trying to get rid of some of their Soviet control over that part of Eastern Europe. I mean, this is a moment where there's a whole lot going on around the world. And with new President Eisenhower, he's trying to do as much of it diplomatically as he can. All right, so there's Cuba. We have a new president, pro-American. Shouldn't be a problem. So by January 1959, however, there is a new uprising, a revolution to overthrow this U.S.-supported dictator Batista, led by Fidel Castro, and his brother Raul is involved as well. And it's a kind of a multi-factional revolution. So it's a really anti-Batista, at least as the U.S. looks at it in 1959. And there's plenty of evidence that Batista is really not a very good guy. New York Times is giving Castro some good press as a reformer, because he's talking about let's do more education, more healthcare, trying to make some changes to the island. Not talking so much as a Marxist or a communist, though there are many in this anti-Batista movement that are, and obviously we'll see that Castro is going to be a communist. During 1959, Castro actually visited the United States looking for new trade agreements, will stay in Harlem. This is right in the middle of the civil rights movement in the United States. And Castro is pointing out how the U.S. doesn't treat its people of color very fairly. Eisenhower refuses to meet with him, sends Vice President Nixon to go meet with him. And Nixon comes back from this meeting saying, no, he's clearly a communist. He's clearly going to be siding with the Soviets. This is a big Cold War issue. It has nothing to do with our special relationship and the fact that we treat him like a colony. And beginning in November 1959, Eisenhower will encourage anti-Castro exiles who've already left Cuba as Castro's coming to power. I kind of skipped the whole thing of Castro winning his faction revolutionary movement against Batista. But in March 1960, Eisenhower is going to approve the CIA-backed military operation against Castro using anti-Castro or pro-Batista exiles who are now in Nicaragua as well as in Florida, and the CIA starts training them. So Cold War is just this fun diplomatic moment with there's lots of different parts of the world that you can look to see, which part of the U.S. government's messing with what part of the world, and are they doing something more positive, something more negative? This actually harkens back to a lot of U.S. Traditional policy against Latin America, which tends to be kind of neo-colonial. All right, so there's Castro meeting with Che Rivera, who is a kind of a pan-Latinist revolutionary trying to help other countries, trying to get rid of their Western control. And there's later the new leader of the Soviet Union, that's Nikita Khrushchev, give a nice bear hug to Castro. And this one I just threw up because that's Ernest Hemingway, who likes to write about Cuba and visit there, happens to meet with Castro. All right, so Castro's conflict with the United States. So we got to get into the Cold War. So is Castro really just an anti-Batista? Does he want to just be a dictator? Is this part of the Cold War? Is this part of just a civil war or insurrection going on in Cuba? Well, yes, it's all these things. But from the United States point of view, it's part of the Cold War. And so the U.S. policy beginning in 1960, because we as students have stopped looking over at Vietnam. That's still going on over there. U.S. is involved over there with nation building. And now it's looking at Cuba to make sure that the person we want in charge is in charge. And if we do that, the United States will cut sugar imports from Cuba. We're one of the main buyers of sugar, put a lot of U.S. cash into Cuba. We stopped buying that sugar, and so Cuba's got to find a new buyer. Well, it's kind of a dumb move because the new buyer is going to be the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union doesn't have a hard currency that it trades on the open market at this time, so it's going to do a trade agreement where it's going to exchange USSR oil for Cuban sugar. Seems like a good deal for them, and these oil tankers will bring Soviet oil to Cuba to be refined in these U.S.-owned refineries that turn it into gasoline and heating oil. Of course, those U.S.-owned refineries will then be ordered to not refine Soviet oil. So Castro then does what any sovereign nation can do. It will nationalize these refineries. It's going to buy them out. It's going to take them over. It's going to force them to sell them to the government of Cuba, and has to pay for them. And they tend to look at old tax documents to figure out how to pay and how much money they're worth. And clearly, as you know, U.S. corporations like to lie on their tax documents, particularly in foreign countries. But the United States will block any loans that Castro could get to pay for these refineries, even knowing that they're going to make money because the oil companies are making money there. But all of this is, again, trying to weaken Castro so he'll be pushed out of office or have an uprising against him. But it's really pushing him more and more into the hands of the Soviet Union. So this is kind of all going on during the election year of 1960. John F. Kennedy wins the election in 1960. In January 1961, just before Kennedy is sworn in as the new president of the United States, President Eisenhower is going to sever diplomatic ties with Cuba, which is often a sign that you're getting ready for a military intervention or a war with a country when you stop talking to them 100% here. All right, so now we've kind of got this Cuba issue going on, 90 miles off the coast of Florida. We got this Vietnam thing going on as well with this civil war going on, but most Americans don't even know where Vietnam is and they don't really care about it. Laos has actually got some things going on. There's other parts of the world that are having their own struggles in 1960, but this is about the Cold War, so let's get back into that. So John F. Kennedy inherits this Cuba problem. He inherits the Vietnam problem as well. And the CIA was already had this attack in the works. Now, new president comes into office. CIA, they don't change office. They have a 10-year appointment as director of the CIA. You can fire them and hire new people, but it's supposed to be non-political. CIA director is Allen Dulles. He's the brother of the outgoing Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. So during the 1950s, the Dulles brothers basically ran Latin American foreign policy the same way it's been run for a long time, in the favor of U.S. companies and control over Latin American countries. But Allen Dulles convinces John F. Kennedy that these exiles would defeat Castro, that Castro's unpopular, he's a communist, nobody likes communists, there's going to be this uprising as soon as these exiles show back up and show that Castro's weak, and Kennedy loves it. He's a Cold Warrior himself. He had fought in World War II. He thinks this is a great opportunity to show the pro-American countries are really in ascendancy and that he's a powerful president that's supporting these people overthrowing the authoritarian Cuban communists led by Fidel Castro. Now here's the problem though, is these exiles are mostly ex-Batista leaders and their children. These ex Batista leaders and their children are corrupt people who've been working with the casinos and the mafia and are not pro-democracy by any stretch of the imagination, so they don't really have any popular support. They're the children of the super wealthy, which are obviously, the communists are not excited about the super wealthy. But John F. Kennedy, he's only been president for a couple months as this plan is going forward, and he's not going to question it. Why would he be worried about a CIA plan? All right. So the plan is that the anti-Castro rebels will land in what's known as the Bay of Pigs. So it's here in the southern part of Cuba. And they're going to use actually United Fruit Company ships. The United Fruit Company, again, which owns some land in Cuba, is going to donate ships to help get these anti-Castro rebels there. And the U.S. Air Force is going to paint some of their older planes white, and they're going to use that to destroy any air power of of Castro's Air Force. So that way this landing can occur, and then there'll be the spontaneous uprising. And the U.S. fingerprints on it won't be seen. It'll be seen as much more kind of pro-Americans coming back into power in Cuba, kind of the way it should be. All right, doesn't go that way, though. So Cuban exiles fight on the ground while U.S. destroyed Cuban air power. Uprising is supposed to occur. This does not occur. CIA is completely wrong. Castro is popular when compared to Batista or any of the previous dictators at this moment. He is making reforms that the poor and the regular people are looking forward to. This Bay of Pigs landing occurs on the 17th of April, 1961. U.S. planes will bomb the airfield near the Bay of Pigs. United Fruit cargo ships attempt to land, but they're not landing craft. Some of them capsize. Some of them are... These men are just dumped into these muddy beaches. It's partly swampland nearby. It's a horrible place to do a landing. Castro's army is on the beach or up in the hills waiting for this because, Castro's got spies in the United States. He knows what's going on. And many of them are gunned down. And in reality, again, looking at this number here, you got 1,400 exiles attacking Cuba. And Castro's got an army of 200,000. So... these Cuban exiles, actually, the argument really is that the exiles believed that the United States was going to send in the Marines, and they were not going to do it all by themselves, even though that's what the CIA said was going to happen. That the CIA was basically figured that once things didn't go quite as smoothly as you wanted, they would say, hey, President Kennedy, we need to send in the military to make sure this whole process actually goes forward. But that's not what what Allen Dulles had told Kennedy. Kennedy, he's been president now 3 months. He's like, no, I'm not going to send in the military. This is not what you said was going to happen. You said this was going to be an uprising led by anti-Castro exiles, and that the United States would be able to sit back and point to it as a success of people who hate communists rising up against communists, and we're just giving them tacit support, and he refuses. So there's kind of the beginning of a change in the relationship of our special relationship with Cuba. So here you can see this Bay of Pigs, swamps nearby. It's very shallow, muddy swamps over here. This is not a great place to do a landing. Maybe they thought it was isolated, and that's why they had better luck there. Castro reports exiles wiped out. They're going to capture a lot of these, torture them, and some will be released finally to the United States or kicked out of Cuba at a later date. But this is, why Cubans in Florida tend to hate the Democratic Party and hate President Kennedy because they see this U.S. not coming to their aid during the Bay of Pigs as reneging or being traitors to their cause. Now, again, Kennedy hadn't promised to do what Allen Dulles had promised, so it's a lot more complicated story, but the United States does not go and protect these anti-Castro, pro-Batista exiles. All right, so this is a total embarrassment for the United States. U.S. involvement is obvious. Castro is strengthened by it. He's defeated this U.S. attempt here, so he's now stronger within Cuba. John F. Kennedy will go on TV, and he will take the blame for this failure as a brand new president. And ultimately, Allen Dulles will be fired, but he's not going to do that immediately. That will happen later in the year. Kennedy's first foreign policy initiative is a failure. Kennedy blames and hates Castro, and he's going to spend the rest of his time often trying to overthrow Castro in more spy-like ways. They literally sent him exploding cigars trying to kill him. They tried to concoct something that would make his beard fall out with the idea that would make people think he's not manly. This is some of the worst spy versus spy stuff going on in Cuba in the 60s and 70s. It's just hard to even believe any of it. So, but Castro's now deep in the Soviet camp. So it's a clear loss of territory. What had been pro-American, or at least an unofficial colony of the United States, is now pro-Soviet and pro-communist. And this Cold War now just looks horrendous, even worse than it did in the early 50s, because now there's this country right nearby that is, ally of the Soviet Union. All right. Now later the next year, actually Kennedy meets with Khrushchev if I remember, in Vienna. And you can see Khrushchev has a nice big smile on his face. They're struggling about the Cold War issues. The Soviets have a little bit of a win, and they're going to push it. They're going to then send nuclear weapons into Cuba to try to see what kind of advantage they can take, or really kind of level the playing field. Because the United States has nuclear weapons in Europe that are very close to the Soviet Union. All right, so let's deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then we can get back to Vietnam. So 3 weeks before the midterm elections in 1962, so Kennedy gets elected in 60, he'll be reelected the next presidential election in 64. 40 medium-range missiles are sent to Cuba from the Soviet Union, and we're going to see the United States get within a hair's breadth of World War III, a nuclear war between the United States and the Cold War. So we see this moment of heightened tensions get to the point really where they just about not launch the missiles. U-2 spy planes, that's the type of spy plane that flies very, very high in the air. It's hard to shoot down. It's photographed these missile bases that are being built in Cuba by the Soviet Union. They look exactly like the missile bases in the Soviet Union that the United States has been taking photographs of and spying on. And they bring it to the National Security Council, which then brings it to the president. And the president, just Kennedy's flabbergasted by this. He's like, okay, this is super serious. And he puts together an emergency committee that he calls the Executive Committee. So it's got part of the National Security Council. It's got some other members of it as well, and they're gonna keep this all a secret. This is gonna, for the first 5 days or so, nobody knows about what's going on in Cuba, except for the United States federal government and obviously the Soviet Union to a certain degree. So here's the famous photos of these medium-range ballistic missile launch sites that are being built in Cuba with fuel tanks and showing where the launch things would be. Here they are on the map showing the 3 main sites, and they're from the year before the Bay of Pigs. And we don't know exactly at that time how far these missiles could go. They're pretty sure it can get all the way to New York without any problems. It's later kind of given proof that they could go much further than that. They're medium range. But all of this could occur literally within 15 minutes of a launch to destroying some of the major cities in the United States. So it's a major Cold War concern. Now, here's this moment in history where we in the future know a lot more about what was happening than those in the past. The United States government under Kennedy is working with the assumption that these missiles are not viable yet. They're not ready to be launched. They don't have all the nuclear material in them. They're in the building process. What we know now is some of them were ready to be launched, and that all of the actions the United States takes is to prevent them from being launchable are being made at a time when some of them are launchable. And that's the other part of how come we're so close to World War III here, because the Soviets could launch some of those missiles at any moment, even though the United States didn't think they could. And the United States will take us all the way up to DEFCON 2. Defense Condition 1 is when you actually are at war. So we're going to be within a hair's breadth of firing nuclear weapons at the Soviet Union as well. All right, so let's kind of go through this a little bit day by day. So ex-con, or executive committee, main military and foreign policy leaders, plus he's going to put his brother, the Attorney General. This is the odd thing about John F. Kennedy. His brother, Bobby Kennedy, is appointed Attorney General of the United States, and he's going to be on this foreign policy committee. Usually Attorney Generals don't deal with foreign policy. They work around the clock. They're trying to get more information. They're trying to come up with different ways of dealing with this. And the key thing we have in these meetings, because they're recording these meetings, is, okay, how should we really react? Should we do the traditional thing? And actually, almost everybody in the room says, let's just invade Cuba. We've invaded it many times before. Let's invade it again, and let's not worry about it. But the many times before occurred before the Cold War. The United States has been talking about how the Soviets are the evil ones who invade countries and put their dictators in charge, and how it's going to look if the United States does that in Cuba. Plus, the minute we invade Cuba, then the Soviets are going to invade West Berlin or invade some other country that they would like to have control over, and we're going to see this spiral out of control. So they kind of pull back from that immediately, and the president says, okay, wait, let's work at the goals. So our number one goal is to get rid of those nuclear missiles, right? We don't want to have missiles that close to the United States. And number two, let's try to avoid a nuclear war. So that's, a nice place to start from. But regardless of whatever they end up doing, they got to prepare for a Soviet response. That this is not just a U.S.-Cuba issue. This is a U.S.-Soviet problem. As I mentioned before, everybody on the committee mostly favors this military invention. RFK soon expresses that, maybe this is a bad option as well with the president. And the president says, look, let's prepare for this military option. But come on, you're some of the smartest guys in the country. Give me some other diplomatic possibilities. What else can we do other than just do an invasion against a country we're not at war with? All right. So the U.S. decides as they're preparing for the military option, what's happening is everybody who's on leave, who's in the military, gets their leave revoked, and suddenly the media wonders why is everybody in the military going back to their bases when nobody said anything weird is happening. Obviously, something's going on. So on the 22nd of October, Kennedy will go on TV and he'll announce that there are these missiles and that the United States is going to blockade, or actually uses the word quarantine. Blockade is a military war, is actually a action that you do during war. So if you're not at war, you can't blockade a country. So that's why they're going to call it a quarantine. 60 ships are sent, going to circle Cuba, going to prevent any more Soviet supplies from getting to Cuba, going to send more U-2 spy planes, going to bring the military up to defense condition 2, DEFCON 2, and basically kind of show the Soviets that we're taking this super serious. Now, the Soviets are actually stunned by this. They're like, they can't imagine that they see us as overreacting. They send a message saying, look, you're acting like pirates, you're violating all of the norms of peace agreements. A blockade is an act of war. Are you declaring war? And the United States, is trying to do something that's not a declaration of war, not an invasion, to try to get what they want here. And Khrushchev does not call back any of his Soviet supplies, but they do slow down a little bit, and they're going to see that they're going to think about it. Now, other thing to know in the 1960s here is there's no direct communication line between the United States and the Soviet Union. Well, I say no, there is a direct communication line. It's a teletype machine. So the way the United States communicates with the Soviet Union is the equivalent of sending text messages back and forth, or what used to be old Morse code messages that are now typed out on a typewriter. But the Soviets send theirs in Russian, we send ours in English, and we have to then translate and figure out what each other is saying in these email or text message exchange. We don't have a phone line. You can't just get on the phone and talk to each other. Now, after all this is over, spoiler alert, no World War III, they will put a phone line in and try to keep this from happening in the future. Now, the United States is going to take this evidence to the UN. And actually, before they let everyone know that there are missile bases there, they're going to ask the Soviet ambassador in the UN, do you have nuclear weapons? Do you have missiles in Cuba? And he will lie to the United Nations, and the United States will pull out the photographs. And so most of the UN and the world is kind of, I won't say they're on our side, but they understand why the United States is reacting this way. And remember, there's a lot of good feelings at this moment towards the United States because of the Marshall Plan and what the United States did in Europe and the anti-colonialism that the United States had been mostly promoting around the world. But this is the end of those good feelings towards the United States after this event. Now, this other picture down here, this is Kennedy. He's often sat in a rocking chair because he had a bad back from his injury when he was in the Navy. This is the Secretary of the Air Force Chief of Staff, Curtis LeMay, who's advocating dropping bombs all over Cuba and just invading and not even dealing with the Soviets at all, but just basically taking over Cuba. And this is one of their meetings. It's a photo op as well. All right. So back to the day by day. So on the 23rd of October, the United States finally gets a strong message from the Soviet Union accusing the United States of illegal actions. But the military shipments aren't called back. That's that first one I mentioned before. On the 26th of October, a second message will come. So this is 3 days later. It's more long and emotional. It seems like it's been looked at, and it comes from Nikita Khrushchev. Some things that maybe he was even drunk while he was dictating this, but it says the Soviet Union would remove the missiles if the United States promised not to invade. So it looks like this has worked. The blockade or the quarantine has worked. The Soviets are going to back down. And before the United States can respond to this message, this just comes to that teletype machine. Right after midnight, or right around midnight, another message comes. This, what some we could call it the third message, the communication from the Soviets since the beginning of the quarantine. It's more formal, seems like it's more thought out, and it adds another element to this deal. It says the United States must remove missiles from Turkey, that the United States has these medium-range nuclear missiles in Turkey, which is just south of the Soviet Union, that they should exchange and do this part of the deal. Now, the U.S. forces, or the United States administration, is super happy about that second message, that it looks like we're going to win. When they hear this third message, suddenly the military is all up in arms. Oh, we can't do that. We can't give in to the Soviets. odd thing is they were going to remove those missiles from Turkey in the next year anyway. The plans were already in the works to decommission them. They were an older style. We didn't really think they should be in the Middle East in the first place. And so making that part of the deal is really, well, it's something we're going to do anyway. But they don't want to look like they're giving in to the Soviet Union, which is always the most odd thing about foreign relations is the men, often men who are in charge, have all these posturing positions that are part of their deal making that don't often deal with the reality of the world around them. All right, so the Cuban Missile Crisis. United States is getting what it demanded. XCOM is still debating if this affects U.S. credibility and its image in the world, that thing I was just talking about. As I said, we already plan to take out the missiles. And while they're figuring out what to do, a surface-to-air missile, SAM, a surface-to-air missile, shoots down a U-2 spy plane. And the U.S. Air Force is now like, oh, we have a provocation now. Let's go to war with Cuba. Kennedy thinks about it overnight, and a new deal is come up with. So what John F. Kennedy decides to do to prevent World War III and a nuclear war and an invasion of Cuba is to send his brother, RFK, Robert F. Kennedy, to go talk to the Soviet ambassador in Washington and offer forth another secret deal. Because these communications, only the U.S. administration knows about these letters or these teletype messages from the Soviet Union. Excuse me. So Robert F. Kennedy will tell the Soviet ambassador that the United States will remove those missiles from Turkey, but that part of the agreement must be kept secret. That the United States is going to ignore that third message and then make public the second message where the Soviets give in to this agreement, and the United States will promise never to invade Cuba if the missiles are removed, and the Soviet Union will then agree to this new aspect of the plan to keep the Turkey missiles secret and have them removed, and this will give the United States this face-saving that they won this Cold War conflict, even though Cuba is now still communist, but at least there aren't nuclear missiles in Cuba. Now again, in the 1990s, there was a historical conference that met in Cuba that Castro went to, and he actually was interviewed and said that had he had control of those missiles during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he would have fired them. Now, it's Castro, he's a blowhard, but he basically was saying that he would have sacrificed all of Cuba to start this communist world revolution or World War III. So it's kind of a crazy thing to say, but he is on the record saying that 30 years after the fact. All right, so why did the Soviet Union put those missiles in Cuba? Again, we're dealing with world history, right? So we're in the middle of the Cold War. From the Soviet perspective, they're like, you have missiles close to us, why can't we have missiles close to you? This is just balancing out this geopolitical power. And again, looking at the Soviet as their Soviet history, this is actually a move by Nikita Khrushchev, the new leader of the Soviet Union, to placate his pro-war military wing of his party, of the Communist Party, because he's been trying to open up trade negotiations with Europe, trying to get more normalization of Soviet interaction with Europe and the rest of the world. And he had to make it look like he was still tough on the U.S. Now, this is the part from the United States perspective that the politicians had trouble with. They just didn't imagine there was politics in the Communist Party. They just saw it as an authoritarian dictatorship ruled by whoever's in charge. During the times of Joe Stalin, they were kind of that way, but Joe Stalin's been dead now almost 10 years, so it's a very different political structure in the Soviet Union that the United States just doesn't understand. There's also been tension between the Soviet Union and China. We talked a little bit about China and it getting help from the Soviet Union, then turning away from the Soviet Union. There's a series of border clashes between China and the Soviet Union. And this, some say Khrushchev is trying to reassert Soviet power in this communist movement around the world. But in reality, like I said, the part that I'm most convinced by is this: Khrushchev is more of a reformer, and this is all part of trying to kind of shake up the gaming table here so that he can look hard against the United States while soft against the Europeans and make some big changes. All right. Ultimately, though, the results is Khrushchev was going to lose power in the Soviet Union. He'll eventually be forced to retire and then will kind of disappear. During the conflict, France actually leaves NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They will then rejoin, but they're so mad that the United States almost started World War III without informing them that they want to leave the club. And the rest of the world kind of learns, well, how is this superpower of the United States going to function? Well, they're going to act unilaterally. especially towards the Soviets. They're our enemy, and we're not going to consult with anybody about how to deal with them. We're not going to allow the Soviets to have nuclear parity, meaning they can't have as many missiles close to us as we have close to them. We have to have this advantage. But our presidents will start to soften this World War III nuclear rhetoric about blowing communists off the planet and bombing them back to the Stone Age, the kind of things they used to say back then. And we'll see from this point forward, a lot of the Cold War conflicts are going to move to third world countries or developing nations. And that's kind of what Cuba is a little bit here, but Cuba has that special relationship with the United States, but this opens the door back for Vietnam. All right, so there's Cuba. There's some other countries that have been had U.S. interventions, and we're back to Vietnam. So clearly, Cuba. Everyone in the United States knows where Cuba is for the most part. They understand its history with the United States. Vietnam has no real history with the United States by the 1960s, but we're going to end up with a full-fledged war over in Vietnam right after the Cuban Missile Crisis. All right, so Kennedy. Let's get back to Kennedy. He's president. 61 to 63. There's still this nation building going on, but historians refer to it as a limited partnership. It looks like the Kennedy administration is trying to back away from this. They're still going to send money and supplies, but they definitely don't want as much U.S. direct involvement in South Vietnam. South Vietnam that looks kind of corrupt, and there's all kinds of problems. It will continue to train the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. There's still the civil war going on with the Viet Cong in the southern half of Vietnam. And they had sent 16,000 U.S. military advisors to help, but these are trainers, these are sergeants, these are not combat forces. They're all about preparing the South Vietnamese army. And they've been doing that for 7 years or more. The U.S. will also give air support to ARVN, and that's for a little bit more involvement there, but really doing more reconnaissance, showing the U.S. has air superiority over Vietnam. And the United States does place 140 helicopters and pre-positioned supplies just in case for 200,000 troops. Now, it's a Cold War. Pre-positioned supplies are all over the world during the Cold War. So this is not unique to Vietnam, but it does give a mixed message about how much the United States is going to be involved in Vietnam in 1963. All right, so by May 1963, Diem's government, the pro-American government, is exploring a peace agreement with North Vietnam. The whole thing's not going well. They just assume to try to figure out a way to end this. And a lot of this would involve the United States leaving South Vietnam in order for South Vietnam to have a peace agreement with North Vietnam. The CIA gets word of this, and they talk to some of the generals, and we're going to see there's going to be a movement to get rid of Diem. But before that happens, again, I went to the next slide, which is in June of 1963, we see protests against the Diem government in South Vietnam by the Buddhist monks. Buddhist monks tend to be pacifists. They tend to not be, obviously, pro-violence. And so when they want to protest the government, they burn themselves alive to make it clear how pissed off they are about this particular action, any action being done by, in this case, the South Vietnamese government. They alert the media, and it's kind of really at this moment in June of 63 that the United States sees that the person that we're supporting, the government we're supporting in South Vietnam, is so hated by their people that some of them will burn themselves alive. Now, at first I thought these were protests against the communists, but these are protests against the pro-American government. Now, the pro-American government, the Diem, his brother's in charge of the military, and Diem and his brother and his sister-in-law are all Christians because a lot of Vietnamese in power had converted to Catholicism or Christianity during the French imperialism period. She refers to these as barbecues. Again, and the media in the U.S. gets on this, and they're like, "This, who are we supporting? What kind of jerks are pro-American in the South Vietnam?" And more Americans are then kind of paying attention. Again, the majority of United States citizens still couldn't care less or don't know anything about Vietnam in 1963. That's all going to change. All right, so end of this limited partnership, right? Kennedy's president in 1963. 62 is the whole Cuban Missile Crisis. We're now in 63. 64 will be Kennedy's re-election. The ARVN generals in South Vietnam, they discuss overthrowing Diem with the CIA. The CIA checks it up to flagpole, goes all the way to Kennedy. Kennedy says, yeah, if he's overthrown, we'll recognize whoever's anti-communist. And there will be then a movement to overthrow Diem. And while he's being overthrown, this coup occurs, the president of South Vietnam will be killed. A week later, the president of the United States will be killed. And so suddenly there's instability both in Vietnam and the United States kind of at the exact same time. So, vice president takes over. Lyndon Baines Johnson. Lyndon Baines Johnson is older than John F. Kennedy. Lyndon Baines Johnson had been majority leader in the Senate during the 1950s. Lyndon Baines Johnson had not served in World War II like Kennedy had, and in 1964, Lyndon Baines Johnson's running for president, and he would like to win a big win, but he has no foreign relation background. He doesn't have any. He's a domestic person. He's a New Dealer from way back when, and he's going to get this incident that's going to give him a chance to show his foreign policy skills. So on the 1st of August, 1964, the USS destroyer, Maddox, is going to, in the turn to draw these two destroyers that are assisting a South Vietnamese operation against North Vietnam, are going to be in what they call international waters. They're within 10 miles of the coastline, and they're going to get involved in this conflict. The PT boats, or torpedo boats from North Vietnam, are going to go out and try to attack these U.S. naval vessels. It's a low-level thing. It's not a major threat, but it is the North Vietnam firing on the U.S. military. 3 days later, these two battleships also in the night believe they're attacked again. Now, that one in the night, that was a snafu, a misreading of the radar during bad weather, but the one on August 1st did occur, but it wasn't that big of a threat. Now, this gives the new president who's running for election in 1964 a chance to say, hey, I'm tough on communists. We've been threatened. Our military has been attacked off the coast of North Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin, and he will put forth this resolution to the Congress, who will vote for it, 460-0 in the House and 88-2 in the Senate, which will give President Johnson basically war authority to fight a war in Vietnam. Now, they don't use the word war. They use, as I have quoted here, all necessary measures to repel any armed attacks against forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. So it's kind of a blank check. They attack this, you can attack them back, and you can prevent further aggression, which means you get to decide when you think they've had enough and that this could end. Now, it's an election year. It's very popular for the United States military to be involved in a Cold War action. That's very limited. Makes LBJ, President Johnson, look good. The guy he's running against is talking about dropping atomic bombs on Vietnam and bombing it back to the Stone Age. Johnson looks more diplomatic and measured. Goldwater, who's his Republican opponent, looks a little bit unhinged in this action, and Johnson's going to win a big landslide victory in 64 using foreign policy, a foreign relation event or Cold War event to try to make him look better in the media. All right, so what does this have to do with the Vietnam War? Well, the Vietnam War started. It has to do with the fact that the president could have stopped it immediately. He said, oh, they shot at us. We blew up a bunch of their stuff. Let's just call it a day. But he doesn't. He's convinced by the Air Force, the U.S. Air Force, that a war with Vietnam can win and North Vietnam communists can be defeated and all of Vietnam can be reunited under a pro-American government. Now, this is a fantasy of Curtis LeMay in the Air Force, who thinks they had just written a report saying that they had won World War II, that they were the deciding factor in World War II by using air power. The problem with air power is it doesn't occupy the ground. And if you're fighting an insurgency that's being fought by people with AK-47s who are going village by village, bombing dirt roads doesn't do anything because dirt roads are easily repaired. Bombing factories in an industrialized nation like Germany, that has a big effect. Taking a country that's in its industrial revolution, that's pre-industrial, and destroying it, and some of those weapons are getting shipped to it from Russia and from China, doesn't do anything. But this is the beginning of what's known as Rolling Thunder, this air attack. Non-stop air attack, dropping more bombs ultimately on North Vietnam than the United States dropped on Germany during World War II. And also gradual escalation. The United States is first just using air power and naval power. Then they're going to slowly send in U.S. military to protect those air bases. And then they're going to send the U.S. Army to do some combat operations against the North Vietnamese Army and against the Viet Cong. By 1965, there's 125,000 U.S. soldiers in Vietnam. By December 1967, there's 500,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam fighting against the Viet Cong, against the North Vietnamese. Just every month they were sending in more and more. Oh, we need more. This is going to be done. Oh, this is an easy war. It's a little tiny country. But it's almost 4 years into this war with Vietnam, unofficial war because they don't use the word war. And the United States hasn't defeated this tiny little country where after fighting 4 years of the Nazis, that war was almost all but over. So the United States people, because the draft is still going on, are kind of confused as to, well, what is this war? Is it just like Korea? Is it different? Is it useful? Why am I sending my 18-year-old son to go and die in the jungles in Vietnam? Well, it looks like things actually have calmed down by the winter of 67, 68. Now, 68 is a re-election year for Johnson. The war has quieted down. Now, what we know as historians is the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese are planning for a special attack on a Lunar New Year, Tet holiday. And so they've stopped doing any major insurgency attacks. The U.S. military looks at this as they've kind of won. Everything looks good. There's less fighting going on. The Secretary of Defense brings over the media. They take photos. They talk about how U.S. has killed more of them than they've killed of us. And that means we're winning and everything looks cool and the war is almost over. This is important because the war is not almost over and all hell's about to break loose. That this lull in the fighting was the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong preparing for a major attack. And that major attack is known as the Tet Offensive. So, in our Cold War, we have this hot war. In this hot war, it's both part of the Cold War and it's a war for independence. We have the North Vietnamese government and the South Vietnamese government that are at odds, and they both say they should control the whole area. And we have this Viet Minh, who's now called the Viet Cong, who are down doing this uprising. This Tet Offensive is relatively effective. 64 cities are attacked on the same day. North Vietnamese army is supposed to attack across the DMZ at the same time. They don't, which is kind of the odd thing about that goes wrong from the North Vietnamese military perspective. From the South Vietnamese and the U.S. military perspective, yes, the day of the attack is a big success for North Vietnam and Viet Cong, but ultimately all 64 cities are recaptured. This Tet Offensive is a failure. The offensive doesn't gain any new land. The United States military defeats all of it. This is a military win for the United States because they pretty much destroy the Viet Minh or the Viet Cong. They're almost wiped out in this attack because all the positions are now open. They're all seen. They're all involved in holding these cities, and they're almost all killed. So after this moment, the Vietnam War becomes much more of a North versus South without that guerrilla insurgency, though that insurgency will regrow in the rural areas. And you want to learn more about Vietnam, take Dr. Paulie's Vietnam War history class, and you can spend a whole semester on it. All right. This picture I like to put up because that's the police commissioner of Saigon. So he's the pro-American, pro-democracy guy, quote unquote. And that's a suspected Viet Minh rebel that they have handcuffed, and he then shoots him in the head. And it's on TV, it's filmed. And so it doesn't give him any rights. He's clearly a captive. You're not supposed to shoot captives. But the side that the U.S. is supporting violates the rules of war all the time. All right. So, like I said, the reality of Tet is, from a military point of view, it's a U.S. victory and the North Vietnamese loss. From a propaganda point of view, it shows that the U.S. military and the U.S. government's been lying about the Vietnam War and describing it in ways that aren't accurate because this war is not almost over and it's going to go on for another 5 years. So the U.S. military won this fight. Political victory for the Viet Cong and North Vietnam. Military victory for the United States. But from this point forward, the United States wants out of this war. That the United States does not see it as a good idea. They don't see it as a vital part of the Cold War. They don't really care if the Vietnamese and the Cambodians or anyone else becomes communist on the other side of the world. In this Cold War that almost started World War III in 1962, and now in 1968 is again causing the death of Americans more directly, looks bad. Lyndon Baines Johnson in March of 68, shortly after the Tet Offensive, will then not run for re-election, surprising everybody. So now our elections in 1968 are all up in the air, which is perfect for Richard Nixon because he's running for president in 1968 and he's going to run as a Cold Warrior. All right, so what President Johnson is going to try to do is not run for re-election and try to end this war in Vietnam. He doesn't want to admit defeat. He wants to come up with some kind of a peace treaty. He's not going to get that peace treaty, partly because Henry Kissinger, who's working for Nixon, is going to be on this peace commission, is going to kind of sabotage it a little bit, but save that for another conversation. And then, like I said, in 68, you can see the United States finally wants this war to be over, that it's going on and not serving a purpose. All right. So, our Cold War. We're going to get a new president. I'm going to go very quickly through the Nixon years. He's going to do what he calls Vietnamization. He's going to be much more involved. You can see in this picture, Nixon wins the election in 1968. We do have a third-party candidate, if you're interested in. That's George Wallace, the pro-segregation, the pro-racist candidate carrying the southern states. Nixon gets elected. He says, we're going to go back to just using mostly air power. He's going to pull U.S. troops out of Vietnam. Ultimately, he's going to negotiate a peace with North Vietnam while opening the door to China. Now, it's 1970, 71, 72, and the United States still doesn't talk to a communist China. So what Nixon does is says, look, if we're playing the Cold War on the chessboard of the whole world, we need to bring some other players into this conversation. And he believes by putting more favoritism on China, which is showing itself to be a little bit more engaged than the Soviets are at this moment. The Soviets are looking a little bit weaker overall. That can put pressure on Vietnam and they can come up with a peace agreement, and they do. So, there it is, February 1972, which is the re-election year for Nixon. So 4 years of Nixon running the war. Nixon grabs world attention by making a secret flight to China, meeting with Mao Zedong, beginning the normalization process with the Chinese so we can have this diplomatic relations with China and trade relations. And again, this is not the China that you know today. It's an industrial powerhouse in the 21st century. It's gotten through most of its industrial revolution, and it's beginning to get in that direction. And the United States will agree to the one China policy, which basically says our friends who are living in Taiwan, the Kuomintang friends, are now, well, we're going to say they're part of China, but you're not allowed to take them over. We're still going to defend them. And that whole policy gets even more complicated. So this, again, puts pressure on the Soviets who see this China-U.S. Sino-Soviet alliance possibly, or at least agreement. And so it's a way of trying to get these limited wars in Vietnam and other areas to maybe kind of wrap up by getting a peace agreement. And they do. In January 1973, after the election, Nixon gets reelected. In January 73, peace treaty, a ceasefire is negotiated between the North Vietnamese and the U.S. South Vietnam is left out of the agreement. So basically, the United States says, we're going to leave South Vietnam. You can continue fighting your civil war between North and South. We won't be involved, and we stop fighting. Now, it takes 2 more years, from 73 to 75. The civil war between the North and the South continues, and then in April 27, 1975, North Vietnamese troops will take over the capital, South Vietnam, Saigon, and the United States will evacuate the last of the Americans who are in Vietnam, as well as some of the pro-American South Vietnamese. And again, South Vietnam ceases to exist. Vietnam becomes a communist country, and can be seen again as another loss in the Cold War. But as world historians, we can look at this as a win in the anti-colonial wars from the Enlightenment period, because we see that from the Vietnamese perspective, this has always been about Vietnamese independence. They got wrapped up in the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States is I would argue, a mistake and or a bad idea. But ultimately, the United States has to take a loss here about a country that mostly they couldn't care anything about at the time, and it just became a pawn in this Cold War struggle. All right, I won't test you on any dates, but people always ask, and this is why it's a big deal often, or has been in the United States, is 3 million Americans are going to be deployed in this part of Asia during the Vietnam War. So we have lots of veterans, baby boom veterans in the United States, many of which are obviously getting old, retired, and dying. But in the 1980s and 90s, this is just on everybody's mindset in the United States. In the same way that people who fought in Afghanistan and Iraq, those veterans are part of how people in their 20s and 30s and 40s think about the military in the 21st century. All right, so let's kind of get back to the Cold War aspect of it. So Vietnam's out of the way. Vietnam's going to go its own way. The United States has normal relationships with Vietnam. They still have a one-party system with the Communist Party. But the United States and the Soviet Union have got to this moment in the 70s where they now both agree that any nuclear war between the Soviets and the United States is going to destroy the planet. Mutually assured destruction was the shorthand for it. That wouldn't kill everybody on the planet, but it would destroy all the nations that are involved in the war, and would have this long-term, radiation circulating the planet. So they start negotiating. So this brings the Soviet Union to the table with Nixon to negotiate the strategic arms limitation talks. So this is a reduction of tension, this thing called détente. That, look, we don't want to have war with you, Soviet Union. We understand you're still authoritarian dictators. We're going to negotiate with you like we did with Vietnam. We're going to try to figure out some balance to the world where, yes, they can be communists and they become capitalists and democracies and dictators. And maybe we can all just learn to get along with each other. Now, this is also evidence as we look back of the Soviet Union getting weaker, but they have their hardliners, their pro-military in power for the moment. But I'm going to wrap up the Cold War in the next lecture. But let's finish with détente.